This is America's day. This is democracy's day, a day of history and hope, of renewal and resolve.
The U.S. has a new president as Joe Biden takes over from Donald Trump and begins a new chapter in American history. What lies ahead for his administration and for a country in crisis? Hello and welcome to a special edition of Inside America with me, Ghida Fakhry, live from Washington, D.C. Joe Biden has been sworn in as America's 46th president on the steps of the U.S. Capitol under extraordinary circumstances. The inauguration, which was already scaled back due to the pandemic, took place under heavy security exactly 2 weeks after pro-Trump supporters stormed the Capitol building. In the lead-up to the inauguration, the FBI, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, informed law enforcement agencies that far-right extremists and supporters of the QAnon conspiracy movement may have been planning to infiltrate the inauguration by posing as National Guard members. Now, this follows the January 6th attacks on Capitol Hill that left 5 people dead, including a police officer. The unprecedented breach of the Capitol building led to the deployment of about 25,000 National Guard troops from Washington, D.C. and other states across the country, with at least 2 off-duty police officers charged with participating in the insurrection and others being investigated for suspicious behavior. The Defense Department conducted special vetting for the National Guard troops tasked with securing today's inauguration, screening them for links to domestic extremists and white supremacists. The FBI also warned a couple of days ago of armed protests at all 50 state capitals, while Biden's nominee to lead the Department of Homeland Security called the threat of domestic extremism, quote, one of the greatest challenges confronting his department, with the incoming national security team signaling that it will now focus on investigating right-wing groups like QAnon. So then what can the new administration do to address the growing threat, the growing security threat, and what does security at today's inauguration tell us about the challenges that lie ahead for the Biden-Harris administration? To discuss all this and more, I'm joined by former Democratic Congressman from Illinois, Luis Gutierrez. Congressman Gutierrez, it's good to have you with us. I know you were at Joe Biden's swearing-in ceremony a couple of hours ago. What was it like for you to be part of this inauguration, to be part of this very limited, select group of about 1,000 dignitaries and former dignitaries in attendance?
It was quite an honor and a very distinctive privilege. I was obviously very saddened as I walked through the tunnels and walked through the Capitol. On my way there, I went to have breakfast, went to try to visit my old colleagues and see the hundreds of soldiers in huts throughout the basement and the tunnels of the Capitol. I know we all saw them in the exterior, but in the Capitol itself told me how precarious, right? Democracy can be, how precarious the republic that is the United States of America can be, that you have to call upon 25,000 soldiers to have a peaceful transition of power from Trump to Biden today. But it was a great day. Look, I just came from the island of Puerto Rico. And so for me, it was a little personal, right? To watch Supreme Court Justice Sotomayor, Puerto Rican, right? Swearing in a black woman as vice president of the United States. What a great message. We had Donald Trump and his anti-woman rampage for over 4 years. And we had 2 women, Supreme Court Justice and the first black vice president of the United States. And it was just thrilling to see that mosaic being built and being transmitted across the world. It's part of the healing process of who we are, right? We are the American mosaic of so many different colors and traditions. Take,
though, Congressman?
Yes, sexual orientation.
But what more will it take, though, to heal the nation, which is, as you say, still railing from the violence exactly 2 weeks ago, still dealing with the scars of the past, the racial injustice, and so much else that is going on here, and the fact that so many people in the United States today, 3 out of 4 Republican voters, do not believe that Joe Biden is the legitimate winner of the election. They do not view him as the president. Where does he begin, not only to heal the nation, but also to unite every American behind his agenda?
I think that began today, obviously, with his swearing in and with his message. But look, let's be clear. You cannot heal something that you do not recognize as an illness. As something that is wrong, right? And for too long in America, we have simply ignored the systemic racism which exists. So for a man of color who was born in 1953, when separate but equal was the law of the land, and my parents could not rent an apartment in neighborhoods. There were gyms and gymnasiums and swimming pools and schools I could not go to. So I understand that experience, and I think, and my hope is that the shock of January 6th awakens in all Americans that understanding that there is something vitally wrong with America that we need to heal, that we need to contend with. And I think the president was very clear today. He said, I am going to work just as hard for everyone that voted for me, but I'm going to work just as hard for those who didn't vote for me. What a dramatic change in message from Donald Trump, which we all understood was only for himself and for his supporters. So I think that kind of message today. The other thing, it was an aspirational message, wasn't it?
Well,
it said there are 400,000
Congressman,
people dead. We're going to contradict. Go ahead, I'm sorry.
There certainly was a very different tone to the message that Joe Biden articulated. Obviously, there was also that sense of empathy, as you say, towards the 400,000 people who lost their lives and towards their loved ones. But there is the need, many Democrats, many people in your party say, the need for accountability. How does accountability and retribution today serve this bigger goal of unity? Can Democrats go down that path and try to convict President Trump in a Senate trial that could very well happen towards the end of the week? We hear that Nancy Pelosi, the House Speaker, is going to be sending those articles of impeachment to the Senate, which will then trigger the Senate trial sometime thereafter. Is it the right thing to do? Or do you have much more pressing issues to deal with first?
I think we can watch. We can walk and chew gum at the same time. We need to be able to do both things. Look, if anything Donald Trump taught us is that he saw himself and acted in numerous occasions through his action as though he were above the law, including wanting at the end to to give himself a self-pardon, which he didn't do. But my point is, that is Donald Trump, right? The man that's above the law. The man that said, you know what, no more Muslims in this country and no more immigrants. And I'm going to cage immigrant children at the border. I'm going to say to the Black community and to the Latino community, your civil rights and voting rights are not something that's important to me. So he always thought of himself as being above the law. And so you have to make sure that he isn't seen as such. Otherwise, the democracy is weaker. I think we can do that. And at the same time, bring science. I mean, if anything, don't you think one of the most important messages of Biden today was truth, facts, no more manipulation of facts, and we are going to be guided by the truth? That was a very clear message to the lies upon lies this administration of Trump has based itself on. So look, if we use science, 2 + 2 will always be 4, and a triangle will always have 3 angles to it. That's what we need to do. We need to force the truth.
You, Congressman, have called him the insurrectionist in chief. Many have accused him of stoking racial division in this country, of not creating the threat of white supremacists, which existed before Donald Trump, but of allowing it to come out to the fore, of the GOP, the Republican Party, embracing some of these right-wing extremists and conspiracy theorists. Joe Biden says he wants to send a different message on day one, including signing several executive orders. We heard anywhere between 12 and possibly even 15 executive orders on day one. One of them will have to do with an issue that is dear to your heart, the issue of immigration. I know you've been fighting for a long time to achieve a new system of immigration to allow for what you say is the dignity of those who undocumented immigrants who come to this country as children. He will now allow for a path towards citizenship, we understand, for these undocumented migrants, the so-called dreamers. How important is this beyond its symbolism? And how achievable is it with today's rise in racial tensions?
I think it is achievable. Here's the contradiction, the irony, right, of this all. That Donald Trump, after 4 years in office, has created among the majority of the American public, support for comprehensive immigration reform. Immigrants have never been seen by the numbers of Americans in the positive manner in which they're seen today. I know it's a contradiction, but even 30% of Trump supporters believe in comprehensive immigration reform. So it's a rejection. Let me just share with you, tomorrow at 11 o'clock, there's going to be a national call. I just checked before I came on the program with you. We have 992 people signed up for that call, where I will be introducing Senator Bob Menendez of New Jersey, because he'll be introducing the comprehensive immigration bill for the Biden administration. And we're going to give a briefing. That's the way you counteract, right? The weakening of our democracy, by bringing people together and educating them and expanding the base. And I am going to say to the immigrants, make sure we bring the Polish immigrant forward, the tens of thousands of Irish immigrants forward. I love to see my Latino immigrants, but I want to see the Korean immigrants and the Chinese immigrants. I want to see the African immigrants. Let's show the true mosaic of who the immigrants are to this country so that we can confront it with facts. It is not just people of color that need comprehensive immigration reform. There are literally hundreds of thousands of white immigrants to this country that I will fight tirelessly for until they receive their just compensation from the government in terms of legalization.
The ideals of a multiracial, diverse United States of America. Former Congressman Luis Gutierrez, thank you so much for making the time to join us. Really
it's been a pleasure. Good luck and Godspeed to you.
Thank you. Same to you. Now, many here in the United States are wondering whether President Biden will be able to unify all Americans, not just the 81 million Americans who voted for him, but the 74 million Americans who voted for Donald Trump as he tries to restore trust in the country's democratic institutions. In a recent poll, 74% of American voters believe American democracy is under threat. Biden faces several urgent challenges, from the recent violence and attempted insurrection to the economic crisis, the coronavirus pandemic that continues to wreak havoc across the U.S. with more than 200,000 new infections and more than 3,500 deaths in the last 24 hours alone. Making a pledge to have, quote, at least 100 million COVID vaccine shots into the arms of the American people. During his first 100 days in office, Biden faces yet another daunting reality. Of the 20 million people the Trump administration had vowed to vaccinate by the end of last year, only 3 million have received the vaccine. So then, can Biden's coronavirus task force bring the pandemic under control while juggling so many other issues, including the impeachment trial of the former president and his attempts to confirm his cabinet nominations as well? Joining me now to discuss this is Joe Grogan, former director of the United States Domestic Policy Council and former assistant to then President Donald Trump. Mr. Grogan, the outgoing president who never formally conceded but skipped the inauguration with his vice president essentially stepping into his shoes, downplayed for a very long time the threat of the coronavirus. He did say today that we will be back in some form. I know you worked with him on getting the virus under control. How receptive do you think the American public will be, say, 4 years from now, when you consider the way Donald Trump handled one of the key challenges of his last year in office, the pandemic? How receptive might Americans be to any notion of him being back in one form or the other?
Well, it remains to be seen what he meant in those comments about coming back. I mean, I doubt that he's going to want to, become a man of letters at his home in Florida and not get back to communicating with the American people. We're a long distance away, though, before we have to consider him running again for any type of elected office. But let's remember, he had 75 million people vote for him. More people voted for him in this last election than voted for Barack Obama. Now, he still lost the election, and Joe Biden is coming in with some difficult tasks ahead. But I don't think it's worthwhile to just focus on Joe Biden's task in unifying the country writ large. He also needs to unify the Democratic coalition that put him in office, which is not going to be an easy task, especially when they're not looking for unity in many instances. They're looking for, in some cases, revenge. In some cases, they want to exact maximum punishment on the Republican Party for political advantage, which may be to their short-term political advantage, but it's not in the best interest of the country. We're more divided than we have been in my lifetime, and Washington, D.C., where you and I both are right now, has more troops in it than at any time since the American Civil War. So Joe Biden has a big task ahead of us to figure out how he's going to unify the country and help us get through these difficult challenges that we're facing.
He no doubt has a huge task ahead of him. As you say, the Democrats are not particularly well known for being terribly united, and they do have now two different strands within their party, the progressives and those who like to consider themselves the more centrist moderates. But when you consider the state in which the Republican Party currently is in, the GOP, you said just a few days ago that in fact the riots on the 6th of January were the worst day for the party since the assassination of Abraham Lincoln back in, 1865. How much work do the Republicans themselves have to do? How much reckoning do they have to do to unite their party and to make a clear break or not with some of the more extreme elements within the party that have taken them towards the very far right?
It's a great question. I mean, you hit right on it. A month ago, beginning of December, I thought the Republican Party was in the strongest position it had been in since Ronald Reagan left office, to be completely frank with you. I mean, even when George Herbert Walker Bush lost, the Democrats controlled the House and the Senate right away. And a month ago, the House of Representatives was very evenly divided. Republicans won every single toss-up seat in the congressional races for the House of Representatives. And we were poised to hold on to the Senate. And then we lost both races in the Senate, losing control over that body, although McConnell and Schumer, the Democratic and Republican leaders, are working out a power sharing agreement, but the vice president can break that tie. And then, of course, that was in one day. In the morning, we had lost one seat. By noon, we had lost the second seat as more vote tallies were certified. And then in the afternoon, we had the assault on the Capitol. The Republican Party does have a very big task before it. I cannot right now tell you how it is going to work out, to be honest. There's a lot of people that were drawn to voting for Trump that don't like traditional Republican politicians or traditional Republican policies. It's not inconceivable in the United States that you could have a cleaving of the Republican Party. but it is also not inconceivable you could see a cleaving of the Democratic Party. You could end up with three parties very quickly, happened before in American history. And we'll see as we move forward how the Republican Party deals with a potential impeachment trial in the Senate and an emerging narrative of Joe Biden's actions, which I think will start to arouse more resistance on the part of the American people as they start to see the full effect. Today's his day. He gave a very good speech. But when he was done with that, he started to issue executive orders. A lot of Americans might not focus on them right away, but they will over time as he starts to push more policies.
Forgive me for interrupting you. Joe Grogan, as we speak, we're looking at the motorcade there. We're looking at now President Joe Biden being escorted to the White House, making his way from Arlington Cemetery. We understand being escorted by representatives from all branches of the U.S. military, we understand. He will not be getting the traditional inaugural parade that typically goes down Pennsylvania Avenue. Instead, this presidential escort will take him to the White House for the very first time as President. Biden, just very briefly, we just have a few moments together, Joe Grogan, if you could just speak to the vaccine response, since it is something that you worked on with President Trump, the pandemic, the fact that Joe Biden is inheriting somewhat of a bungled vaccine rollout. The vaccine doses that were promised by the administration apparently are nowhere to be found. Was it lack of competence? Was it lack of transparency? Or was there perhaps an attempt to derail Biden's effort at controlling this virus as quickly as he intends to, or as quickly as he'd like to?
Well, I can assure you that last possibility was not on the table. I mean, there's no way that this was bungled because of an attempt to sabotage Joe Biden's vaccination plan. We'll have 900,000 people getting vaccinated each day now. Starting yesterday, 900,000 Americans got vaccinated. In 100 days, you're on track for 100 million Americans. We vaccinate 90 million Americans every year for the flu. And I think one of the key mistakes they made was not using our traditional commercial channels in the United States and trying to do more of a central plan. Recall, of course, that I left the White House in May, so I didn't have a lot to do or anything to do with this distribution plan. But as an outsider watching it, I think they made a few fundamental assumptions that turned out to be incorrect. And whenever you're trying to do a centrally designed plan and order American doctors and nurses and governors to do certain things that look great on a PowerPoint, it frequently will not work out, and they should have relied more on our private sector distribution system.
All right, Joe Grogan, former assistant to the president and director of the Domestic Policy Council, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Now, in a break with tradition, Donald Trump, as we mentioned earlier, did not attend the inauguration of Joe Biden, becoming the first outgoing president in more than 150 years to do so, and only the fourth in U.S. history. The incoming President Joe Biden now faces a series of key challenges, as we've been discussing. The coronavirus pandemic has already claimed the lives of more than 400,000 people in the United States, with a daily death toll of 3,000 to 4,000. Another grim milestone ahead, the U.S. could reach 500,000 deaths by next month. Now, with the national vaccine distribution plan lagging behind, the economy still struggling, and the U.S. national debt at over $27 trillion, that's almost 40% higher than it was exactly 4 years ago today when Trump became president. Biden also inherits a deeply polarized nation. A recent poll showed 84% of Republicans and 49% of independents said they did not believe Biden's victory was legitimate. So how will Biden unite Americans behind his presidency in a climate of growing distrust and conspiracy theories? I'm joined now by Alan Lichtman, Distinguished Professor of History at the American University here in Washington. He is the author of 12 books, including The Case for Impeachment and Repeal the Second Amendment, The Case for a Safer America, which comes out at the end of the month. Professor Lichtman, there were loud cheers today when Biden took the oath of office, and no doubt a collective sigh of relief in many quarters as well. How will historians look back at this moment, say 20 years from now, with all of its symbolism?
I think they will look at it as one of the most significant transitions in the history of the United States. In a sense, it was symbolically proper that Donald Trump wasn't there, because as you saw in Joe Biden's speech and his executive orders that he's now issuing, he is basically repudiating all that Trump stood for over the last 4 years. But how history will remember will depend not on this inauguration, but on how Joe Biden follows it up. I look at my model at Franklin Roosevelt, who took office in 1933 in the depths of the Great Depression. And what was critical was not just his soaring rhetoric, but the fact that through his relief, reform, and recovery program, he delivered concrete benefits to the American people that made their lives better and eventually brought us out of the Depression. That's what Joe Biden will be remembered for. Is he going to be able to adopt policies that make the lives of Americans better and get us through the current crisis? You know, Abraham Lincoln said, the reason I never pay any attention to my critics is that if things come out well at the end, none of that is going to matter.
If things come out well at the end, there were those who suggested, even advised, that Joe Biden should hold a much smaller affair, given the security threats, given the pandemic, that perhaps this whole inauguration ceremony should have been moved indoors to the White House. I know FDR, who you mentioned, did actually hold a smaller affair at the White House as the country was dealing with the Second World War and so many other issues. In hindsight, though, was it the right decision to have made, to not have retreated in the face of all these threats, to have gone ahead with this inauguration in the traditional way that American inaugurations are done, even though it was a more limited celebration this time?
It was absolutely the right decision. This was a critically important transition. And given the relentless attack on our democracy that we saw not just from Donald Trump, but from so many members of Congress over the last 2.5 months, it was absolutely critical that we have this very important transition. Look, America is a relatively young country. We don't have kings, we don't have queens, we don't have nobles. We have traditions. And one of the most important traditions is the inaugural address and the inaugural ceremony. And it was very important that this tradition, although obviously scaled down, still take place with so much pomp and circumstance. Remember, in 1944, when FDR did it from the White House, he was seceding himself. It wasn't a transition of power.
Interestingly, Professor Lichtman, you famously predicted the outcome of every U.S. presidential election since 1984. You said in 2016 that Trump would win. You predicted in 2020 that he would not. Now you say he is simply not a viable candidate in 2024. Can you count him out, though, if the U.S. Senate does not bar him from holding any public office in the future? Can you count him out despite all of the challenges that he has faced, all the setbacks, the fact that the Washington Post has documented some 30,000 falsehood and lies, that there was accusations of financial self-dealing, 2 impeachments, the riots on Capitol Hill, the list goes on. Can you still count
Yes.
him and his supporters out?
Look, the great British Prime Minister Disraeli once said, finality is not a word we use in politics. But I think it's pretty close to final that we can count out Donald Trump. He's got too much to deal with. He has 400 million plus in debts coming due. He has a horrific IRS audit. His banks are bailing. His businesses, his brand, his approval rating has absolutely cratered. He is off Twitter. He might face prosecution at the state and federal level. He faces a host of civil lawsuits, including one by E. Jean Carroll, where she claimed he raped her in the 1990s and she has DNA evidence, and he's no longer protected by being president. He's got enough to deal with. Plus, as you saw from statements of Mitch McConnell and others, much of the Republican Party, not all of it, certainly much of the leadership, really wants to put Trump and Trumpism behind them. Trump came in, the Republicans controlled everything, the presidency, the House, and the Senate. Now they control nothing. Got to run.
Still to be seen, though, whether Republican leaders in the House will put their vote behind their words. Alan Lichtman, Distinguished Professor of History at American University, thank you so much for making the time. Appreciated.
My great pleasure. Take care.
Now, race relations will be one of the focal points of Biden's presidency. He's already put together one of the most diverse cabinets in the history of the United States, with 50% of the positions allocated to candidates of color. But will these appointments result in the tangible results that civil rights activists and supporters of the Black Lives Matter movement have been calling for? Joining me now is Professor of African American Studies at Princeton University, Imani Perry. Professor Perry, it's great to see you. How hopeful are you? How hopeful should African Americans be today about the future of the United States, given the painful events of the last few years and certainly the last few weeks, beyond the promises and the symbolism of what cabinet members there may or may not be?
That I have is probably not really sort of that particularly relevant. My question, of course, as always, is will we see the policies that connect with the symbolic gestures of the past week? And I, to the extent that there's some hope and possibility, I think I have that, but there's some really serious challenges for Biden with respect to race. On the one hand, he has to deal with the surge in white supremacist, white nationalist extremism and terrorism. And then on the other, he has to deal with the very real issues of racial inequality laid bare by COVID, exposed by the movement for Black Lives, and given that the constituency that made it possible for him to become president is comprised of communities of color, primarily African Americans, he really must respond not just as a rejection of Trump, but as an advocate for that constituency that is really issued a mandate to the Democratic Party. There's a reason we have both the Senate and the presidency Democratic now, and that has to do with the interests of those communities.
The interest of all Americans, you may argue, Professor Perry, to what extent will the Democratic Party that may have ignored some of these threats, the racial divisions that have existed for hundreds of years here in America, to what extent do they have to have a true reckoning with America's past as they move forward beyond the lofty ideals and goals that we hear Joe Biden so eloquently articulate? And to what extent does the GOP itself, which many people would argue has been in some kind of an alliance with white supremacists and extremists for quite some time, to what extent do they also have to look at themselves in the mirror and decide on the path that they want to see this country take over the next 4 years?
I think to a great extent. I think the GOP, it's even a step further. I think that those who have aligned themselves with white supremacist ideology who are in government must be exposed and must be to publicly rejected by our elected officials. Otherwise, there's a tacit acceptance of that as being a legitimate sort of part of the spectrum of American politics. And we have over 400,000 dead from COVID, and there is no more dramatic example of how profoundly unequal this society is along the lines of race, along the lines of socioeconomics, and so there's a way in which history, the ugliness of our history, the original sins of our history, we take, for example, that indigenous people have the highest death rates from COVID, they are right at our doorstep. The Confederate flag was in the US Capitol. We are there. We are in that history at present. So there's no avoiding it. There's no papering over it. It has to be dealt with now. And people have to be clear. Those who are in office have to be clear upon what their vision of the United States is and how they are going to execute that vision.
But how long will it take to create that vision? How long will it take for your sons and the sons and daughters of other African Americans to see the kind of America that they have been yearning for all these years, to see the kind of racial justice that they have fought for, that civil rights activists have fought for in the past and sacrificed so much for? Will it take just one administration, or are we likely to have to wait much longer for this vision to come to life?
I think it's very likely that in the lifetime of anyone who is on the planet now, that we will see a racially just and economically just, justice along lines of gender and sexual orientation in the United States. But I also was really inspired by the young poet laureate Amanda Gorman, who spoke at the inauguration, and about her vision of looking for the light, and that we see this as a kind of ongoing struggle. That's one of the things that Ella Baker, the architect of Freedom Summer in the voting rights campaign in Mississippi, talked about, that the tribe increases as time goes on, and you just commit yourself to the struggle. So I don't think I will live to see it, but I believe that the labor to make it so is important every day.
Professor Imani Perry, always a pleasure to speak with you. Thank you so much for making the time. Now, for the past 4 years, Donald Trump has enjoyed the legal protections that rule out criminal prosecution of a sitting president. But now that he is out of office, Trump faces a series of criminal investigations into possible financial crimes and potential incitement of violence. For more on what is awaiting potentially the former president, Donald Trump, now a private citizen, I'm joined by Michael Zeldin, a former U.S. Justice Department official and legal analyst. Michael Zeldin, the president fought until the very end to overturn the election, to stay in office. But in the end, he knew he had to leave. What happens to Donald Trump now that he is a private citizen? Will the Senate, which moves to Democratic control very shortly, vote to convict him for his role in inciting the violent insurrection 2 weeks ago? Or would it be left to other courts and prosecutors to look into the issue?
Well, thank you, one, for having me, and good afternoon. I am certain that he will be investigated by private prosecutors, public prosecutors, and that the Senate will have a trial. Whether 17 senators on the Republican side of the aisle join what will likely be 50 Democrats on the Democratic side of the aisle remains to be seen. The evidence is pretty stark, what the president did to incite the violence at the U.S. Capitol. But I think there are a lot of people who feel that it's best to just move on and not indict and convict the president. But many think that the normalization of that sort of behavior has to be stopped right now. And so I think it's going to be a very interesting trial. As to the federal prosecutors and the state prosecutors who will look at him, there's no question but they're going to continue to look, and there'll be private lawsuits that are still continuing. So he's got a lot of legal issues that he's going to face now that he's a private citizen.
He does indeed. You mentioned the 67 votes that may be needed within the 100-member Senate. But, and we've been hearing a lot about that, 17 more votes than the Democrats have. But at the end of the day, the Constitution does say this. It says no person shall be convicted without the concurrence of 2/3 of the members present. So you could, in fact, get a conviction, couldn't you, in this potential trial with fewer senators voting to convict if fewer senators show up?
Well, I think they all must show up. So the rules of the Senate require, unless you have a overarching health reason not to show up, I think that the rules of the Senate require you to be there. So I think the expectation is that all 100 senators will be there, and that the House managers who will present the case as prosecutors in the Senate are hoping to get 67 senators to vote in favor of conviction. The way the process works is the House of Representatives, which is the lower house effectively, brings the charges. That's called the articles of impeachment. And then they present those to the senators who are the jurors, and the jurors hear the evidence that the House presents, and then they vote just as if it were a criminal trial where the senators are the jury and the House is the federal prosecutor.
We are now hearing that the D.C. Attorney General could very well bring charges against Donald Trump, charging him, quote, with possible misdemeanor, a 6 months in jail maximum for his role in inciting the rioters at the Capitol 2 weeks ago. How likely is this to happen?
So people have to understand that the District of Columbia, Washington, D.C., is a unique body. It's a colony, effectively. Where I live in the District of Columbia, we have no senators. We have no voting representation in Congress whatsoever. We are represented in Congress by a non-voting member, and we have an attorney general for the District of Columbia who has limited authority to bring criminal charges. Most criminal charges are brought by the federal authorities, the United States attorney. So the attorney general for the District of Columbia has the power to bring misdemeanor sort of disobedience styled charges. And he has made it quite clear that he is serious in his evaluation of whether Trump's behavior merited prosecution for this misdemeanor of disorderly conduct, essentially. And he'll let us know what he thinks as soon as he gathers all the evidence. It's complicated by the fact that in our law, the First Amendment of the Constitution gives you a right of free speech. And that right of free speech allows you to make fiery political speeches where you are talking about the need for change and fighting for change, and even if necessary, a revolution for change. All of that is permissible speech that's not chargeable as a crime. What's chargeable of a crime is if you have an inciting speech where the incitement follows directly from your speech. For example, if I gave a speech and I said, pointing to someone in the crowd, "Let's kill that man," that speech of mine would not be protected. But if I said, "Let's kill the system that oppresses us so that we can get a better system," that would be protected. So the Attorney General has to evaluate what is First Amendment protected speech versus what is illegal incitement sort of speech.
A fine line. Michael Zeldin, former official at the U.S. Department of Justice, thank you very much for joining us.
Anytime. Thank you for having me.
Now, America's standing around the world took an unprecedented hit during the 4 years of the Trump administration. In September 2020, a Pew Research study looking at how the United States' response to the pandemic has affected America's global image and reputation found that confidence in Trump dipped to a record low 16%, while average favorability toward the United States dropped from 53% to 34%. So will the new president of the United States be able to restore America's deeply battered image around the world and regain the trust of the United States' traditional allies? I'm joined by Thomas Shannon, a 30-year career diplomat and former acting Secretary of State under President Trump in 2017. Ambassador Shannon, good to have you with us. You were acting Secretary of State for a very, very brief period, less than a month, I believe. But when you look at the inauguration today, at what Joe Biden and his brand of diplomacy might represent, there is a lot of work that he still has to do at home, no doubt, to put the house in order before he can tend to the other problems that are facing the world. What kind of leadership do you think we will see from Biden on the international stage? Can the United States, in your opinion, restore its standing and credibility? And what will it take?
Thank you very much, Ghida. It's a tremendous pleasure to be with you today. Today was a great day, and I think President Biden's speech sent a very clear message, not only to Americans, but to the world. First, about unity in the United States and about working to address the domestic problems and issues that the United States faces, but then using that to project the United States back into the world. And I think there's a few steps that he'll be taking in the very short term that will highlight that. First, the return to the World Health Organization showed that the United States is back in the global struggle to fight the pandemic. Secondly, the return to the Paris Climate Agreement to show that this administration will take climate change seriously and begin to assume leadership in this area. And then a return to our alliance-based system and a willingness to work with allies around the world to show that we're capable of being reliable partners. And I think this is going to be a good and a positive and a welcome start.
But isn't it going to take much more than that, though, Ambassador Shannon, the notion of American exceptionalism, this idea that the United States is superior to other nations because it is the world's longest running democracy, that it has the moral authority, the duty to police other nations, all of these issues, that notion itself has taken a huge dent, hasn't it? What will it take beyond a few of these symbolic statements and policy reversals that Biden may be able to achieve? Are we looking at a different kind of America on the world stage from now on?
Well, the world has changed over the past 4 years, in fact, over the past several decades. And the world that President Biden will be inheriting today is different than the world he left at the end of the Obama administration. But I believe the United States remains an exceptional nation. But we're exceptional because we do exceptional things. And I think Joe Biden and his government are intent on showing that we are still capable of doing exceptional things in our benefit and for the benefit of our partners and allies. And this is not something that's going to be fixed overnight. You're absolutely right. This is going to take time. It's going to take effort. And the United States cannot just appear and announce that we're back in charge, because that won't be accepted either by our allies or our adversaries. We're going to have to rebuild confidence that has been lost and a degree of predictability, which is an important part of any country's behavior in the world. But I do believe that the president and his team, which is an exceptional team, a very skilled team and a very experienced team, are going to be able to get to work right away. And then they're going to have to find a way to help the American people understand again why our engagement in the world matters. And this means linking our domestic and our international policy. And this is where I think the pandemic and climate change are going to be so important, because it's going to be an opportunity for the president to show clearly that what we do on the world stage has an immediate impact for the positive for American citizens.
And Ambassador Shannon, as we speak, we're looking at live images here of President Biden, his wife Jill Biden, and some family members speaking to some of their supporters, a limited group of people gathered on Pennsylvania Avenue. As we said earlier, this is not your typical inaugural parade down Pennsylvania Avenue. We understand they're only walking about a block from the White House, waving at supporters. And some of these restrictions have been put in place, not just because of the security threats, but to begin with, this is what we believe was in mind of the organizers because of the pandemic as well. So there you have Joe Biden and his family waving at their supporters very close to the White House as they walk the one block from their new home, which they will walk into in a few moments, I believe. But let me ask you a final question, Ambassador Shannon. Let me ask you a very quick question. We do not have much time, a brief answer if you would. But looking at the level of trust that America has to also restore, a new report shows that in Europe, 1 out of 3 Europeans, I believe, thinks that America cannot be trusted. We know that a lot of European allies have been looking towards China as a more reliable partner. This doesn't bode very well for what Biden is trying to achieve, does it? The fact that there is such a deficit in trust today with America's allies.
The deficit's been growing over time, and it reflects generational changes and different experiences, especially in Europe. But this is where I believe President Biden is going to be successful, because he's going to underscore U.S. support for Europe, both through the European Union, through NATO, and through working with our bilateral partners in Europe. But also, he's going to return values to the center of our diplomacy and our foreign policy. And I think this is going to resonate in a positive way. So it's my hope that we're going to be able to rebuild that standing.
All right, on that positive note, Ambassador Tom Shannon will have to leave it. Thank you very much. A pleasure to see you as always. Thank you.
Thank you.
So how will all of this translate to more specific foreign policy decisions by the Biden-Harris administration? Will Biden choose continuity with some of Trump's foreign policy decisions, or will he seek a clean break and reversal? I'm joined by Trita Parsi, the Executive Vice President at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. Trita Parsi, good to have you with us. Just how badly damaged do you think is America's global brand today? Do you agree with Ambassador Shannon that it may take a little bit of time, but that the United States under Biden is on the right path? Can the U.S. still claim to be a beacon of democracy?
It certainly will take some time to be able to rebuild the trust and the confidence that the United States oftentimes has enjoyed on the international stage. But I think a return to the past is not the pathway to be able to rebuild that trust. Because the Trump phenomenon is not just Trump himself, and it was not born out of nowhere. I think there's been a period of time in which the American public themselves have lost confidence in American foreign policy, have turned against the idea that the United States makes itself and the world more secure by dominating the globe militarily, who do not believe that the United States should play the role of the world policeman, who have seen that those type of instincts have led to endless wars. Many wars that actually were not only built on lies, but also the staying power of those wars, the constant convincing of the public that the war needed to be continued, was also built on lies. All of those different things, I think, help bring about a moment in which someone like Donald Trump could come to office. And just because he has left office doesn't mean that those sentiments in the public have vanished. I think there still is a very strong body of the public that doesn't want to see that type of foreign policy. In fact, if you take a look at almost all of the Democratic candidates in the primary, they all were talking about ending these endless wars. So I think the best path for Biden to be able to rebuild that trust is to also redefine America's position in the world and move towards coexistence and security through collaboration rather than a security based on dominance. And this is going to be particularly important if we're going to have a chance to be able to address issues such as climate change and pandemics that require a tremendous amount of international collaboration, something that is undermined if we at the same time are trying to dominate the globe as a whole.
But do you think that we will see a less interventionist foreign policy than we did see under the Obama first and second terms? We know that the person whom Biden has tapped as his Secretary of State isn't someone who or is rather someone who believes in interventionism and did in the case of Libya and Syria. Are we going to see a less assertive, less aggressive U.S. foreign policy under a Biden-Harris administration, less hubris, less arrogance, and a realignment of certain alliances? What will we see in terms of relationship with the Gulf states, the Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Israel, Iran? Do you think that we will see a rapprochement now that Biden has been sworn in?
Well, I certainly believe that there is a decent chance that there will be less interventionism. It's true that some of the key people in the administration were in favor of the Libya intervention, argued for more intervention in Syria, for instance. But you also have other individuals who have written books about how problematic all of these different regime change efforts have been and how they almost never have worked. And those people are also in this administration. I think there are signs that there's been a bit of a learning curve, and there's at a minimum a realization that the political cost domestically for moving further into an interventionist foreign policy is much, much higher than it was before. When it comes to Iran and the GCC states, I think it will be quite fascinating to see how the Biden administration will deal with Saudi Arabia, for instance. During the campaign, he did say that he wanted to make Saudi Arabia known to be the pariah that it is, which would mark a rather stark shift. Whether he will act on that in that stark manner remains to be seen. But I think there is a fatigue with some of these states in the Middle East who have used their alliance or their strategic partnership with the United States to drag the United States into more rather than less conflict. And I think it would be a much welcome shift from the U.S. side, one that also, again, requires to have a different approach to the Persian Gulf, meaning that the idea that the United States needs to dominate the Persian Gulf, again, has proven itself not to be true. It's not made America more safe, and it certainly has not made the region more safe, but it has led to the United States getting unnecessarily entangled in the rivalries of its strategic partners.
Certainly a lot of expectations. We shall see what a Biden foreign policy looks like in the next few days and months ahead. Trita Parsi, good to have you with us. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me. Appreciate it.
And so here we are today with the start of a new administration. Will it also be the dawn of a new United States of America? As Biden said just a couple of hours ago, it will require so much more than words. It will require unity to make America, quote, the leading force of good in the world, as the 46th president of the U.S. has vowed, will require a long introspection, a true reckoning with what has led the U.S. down this path, what has shaken Americans' belief in their own democracy. It certainly is a historic moment, but so is the inauguration of all presidents. Biden has his work cut out for him, and we shall see where this takes his administration. The task of restoring international standing of the United States in the world may be the easier part of his presidency. That was it for our special Inside America from downtown Washington, D.C. Thank you so much for joining us from the entire team here in Washington. Thanks for watching.